Welcome, Aram Hamparian, to the show. Aram, former president and current Republican candidate Donald Trump in recent days accused his rival Kamala Harris of doing, quote, nothing as 120,000 Armenian Christians were horrifically persecuted and displaced in Artsakh, end quote. He went on to say that if elected, he would work to, quote, stop the violence and ethnic cleansing and restore peace, all caps, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, this is obviously a very public outreach, but I'd like to ask you, given your vantage point as the head of the ANCA in Washington, D.C., what's going on behind the scenes when it comes to outreach from the Trump campaign to the Armenian American community and with advocacy groups like yours?
Sure. What we're seeing is a democracy working the way it should work. Candidates seeking to earn the support of votes, especially critical votes in swing states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada. This is a healthy thing. The candidates, both Harris and Trump, seeking to earn our support, win our votes in these swing states. That's a good thing. Now, we've been through this before. We know very well the dynamics of campaign promises and how they very often, almost always, do not translate into actual concrete policy once these politicians are in office. But they do help frame the debate. They do help sort of create the guidelines or the guideposts within which policy is discussed over the next 4 or 8 years. So that's a healthy thing. We want the candidates to speak out on our issue. We want them to seek our votes. We'll decide among ourselves how seriously we need to take one of them or both of them. And I think there's a lot of skepticism given the past. But ultimately, it's a net positive to see the candidates so aggressively seeking our votes. And this is, I think, mostly because of our work. I mean, it's been really a year's worth of work on the part of the ANCA, but it's also a function of this election being so very close. It may come down to just 2 or 3 states, and those, as it turns out, are states with quite a few Armenians in them. And the Armenians in those states are highly focused, highly attentive, highly driven by the sense that the politicians who armed Azerbaijan, who enabled genocide, who abandoned Artsakh, need to be held accountable.
Understood. So what concrete actions would you like to see in the run-up to the election that would give weight to these words?
Now, Alison, it's a great question. If we've learned anything, it's that the promise of deferred action is almost always hollow. The idea that if elected, I will do A, B, and C. It never takes place. It's a shell game that the politicians have played with us for decades. So what we want are things delivered on the table before election day. So, for example, President Trump can call upon his Republican colleague, Speaker Johnson of the House, and say, let's get a vote on the resolution HR 7288, which would enforce the restriction, the 907 restriction on aid to Azerbaijan. He could do that. Vice President Vance is a sitting member of the Senate. He could co-sponsor and work for passage of SRES 540, which would scrutinize Azerbaijan's human rights abuses with U.S. military aid. On the Democratic side, Vice President Harris could announce a formal enforcement of Section 907. She could ramp up the assistance to Artsakh refugees, which has really been shamefully paltry so far. And of course, she can push for the release of Armenian hostages, setting that as a condition for American participation in the upcoming COP29 climate conference in Baku.
Understood. And what is your level of interaction with the Harris campaign? How are the Democrats working to win over Armenian American voters?
I mean, we're in touch with both campaigns. We're in touch with elected leaders of both parties. But the way we communicate, I would say, there's a formal dialogue and there's an etiquette and a protocol to that. But the way you really communicate with these politicians is by demonstrating to them that you represent many voters and that crossing the Armenian community, in this case, arming a genocide against Artsakh, comes with consequences. If you demonstrate that, they will find ways to meet our standard, as opposed to many groups who simply lower their own standards to endorse the candidate that they prefer based on American partisan considerations. We view it exactly the opposite way, which is we're going to use our leverage in frankly, a bare-knuckled fashion to say these guys need to be held accountable. We're rather unforgiving when it comes to genocide, and we should be, right? And our message to the politicians is you meet the test of holding Azerbaijan accountable, deterring renewed Azerbaijani aggression, creating a pathway for the Armenians of Artsakh to return home. You deliver those things before election day, and if you do that, you'll win hearts and minds in the Armenian world. If you're just making promises on top of a record that is really genocide aligned, then don't expect certainly any formal support from the ANCA, and expect very little support among the grassroots of the Armenian community.
So we're very close to election day. Is the ANCA planning to endorse a candidate, and what would it take to get your endorsement? I'm talking about, of course, the presidential ticket.
Sure. No, we have not endorsed, and it's been pretty clear for many months now that the records don't merit an endorsement. Right? Both, as I said, armed Azerbaijan, enabled genocide, abandoned Artsakh. They both bear the burden, the guilt of that genocide-aligned policy. Add to that neither has in any way renounced or reversed those policies. Certainly, the incumbent ticket has not done so. President Trump has not done so, at least at the level of campaign statements. They've not walked back what they did, and then on top of that, they've said the right words, and we were happy to see Vice President Harris speak about the return of Armenians to Artsakh. That's a good thing. That's now part of the discourse in Washington, because the leader of the Democratic Party has said that the return of Armenians to Artsakh is now part of her party's agenda. The fact that Trump criticized Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, and he used the word Artsakh, that's a good thing. If Armenians, obviously we wear many hats as Armenians in America, some of those hats are partisan hats, but if we were to take off our partisan hat, or Democrat or Republican hat, and look at just the core fact that the top two candidates for the top office in the nation are now speaking in very favorable ways about Artsakh, that's a good thing. We are far ahead of the game today because of those statements than we would be had they not chosen to speak on that issue. So I think that's really, as I said, a tribute to a lot of work on our part, a lot of work with the ANC of Michigan, the ANC of Pennsylvania, the ANC of Nevada, a lot of work, plus the fact this is a tight election where it might be that the margin of victory, Alison, in any given swing state is smaller than the number of Armenians in that state. So, we're well positioned here.
Of course, your legislative priorities will continue long past election day, but back to the endorsement question, I just wonder if one of the parties were to, as you're pressing for, actually help further legislation that the ANCA has been working on before election day, would you consider giving an endorsement?
Anything's possible, Alison, but let me say that with every passing day, the bar gets higher, and that's precisely because the Congress is currently out of session, and the ability of let's say President Trump to talk to Speaker Johnson, all he could get from Speaker Johnson is a commitment to act on this after the election during the lame duck session, and that's a promise, and we know all about promises. There is more time for Vice President Harris to take action because she can, on behalf of her administration, obviously in consultation with the president, take the steps I discussed, which is boycott the COP conference unless the House has been released, dramatically increase the assistance to Artsakh refugees in Armenia, and then announce that there's not going to be another dime, that it is the official policy of the Biden-Harris administration not to spend another dime, to send another nickel to genocidal Azerbaijan, as long as they occupy Armenian territory, as long as they do not allow the return of Armenians to Artsakh, as long as they don't secure the release of every last Armenian hostage.
Thank you so much for your time, Aram, and I'm sure you'll be keeping on the pressure on these candidates. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison.